"Don't waste your time on that pathetic little promotion ceremony," my father said, his voice flat through the phone like he was commenting on the weather. In the background, I heard my sister laughing. "Nobody cares about your promotion," Megan called out loud enough for me to hear every word. I stood in my quarters, still in uniform, phone pressed to my ear, and said nothing for a long moment. Then I answered the only way I knew how. "I understand." I hung up. No family would be coming. But I didn't know yet that in 3 days the entire world would know my name, and they would be the last to find out why. My name is Allison Reed. I'm 32 years old, and for the past 14 years I have worn the uniform of the United States Army. I joined at 18 the day after I graduated high school with a duffel bag packed by my own hands and a bus ticket I paid for myself. No one drove me to the station. No one waved goodbye. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself a lot of things over the years that didn't matter until eventually I stopped telling myself anything at all. I just did the work. That call happened on a Tuesday evening 3 days before my promotion ceremony, to captain a ceremony that would take place on the base where I'd spent the last 2 years, surrounded by people who had watched me train, deploy, and come back changed in ways I never fully explained to anyone, including myself. I had called my parents' house hoping foolishly that this time might be different. I don't know why I still hoped. Old habits, maybe. Or something quieter than habit. Something closer to a wound that never fully closed, no matter how many times I told it to. My father, Richard Reed, owns a small construction supply business 2 towns over from where I grew up. He built it from nothing, and to his credit, he worked hard for it. But somewhere along the way, hard work curdled into arrogance, and arrogance became the lens through which he measured everyone around him, especially his daughters. To him, the military was a place for people who couldn't cut it elsewhere, a steady paycheck for people without better options. He never said it that bluntly to my face, not until that phone call, but I'd felt the sentiment underneath every conversation we'd had for 14 years. Every visit home came wrapped in the same quiet dismissal, the same tightening of his jaw when I mentioned deployments or training exercises, like I was describing a job flipping burgers, rather than a career I had built with blood discipline and years away from everything familiar. My mother stood beside him, and all of it always had. Not once in 14 years did she take my side against him. Not when he mocked my choices at dinner. Not when he forgot my graduation from basic training. Not when he skipped the ceremony where I received my first commendation. She loved peace in her house more than she loved fairness, and I learned a long time ago not to expect her to choose otherwise. And then there was Megan, 4 years younger than me, and the undisputed favorite since the day she was born. She built a modest following online, posting about local restaurants and weekend outings, and our parents treated every post like a headline. Meanwhile, my promotions, my training certifications, the medal I received after my second deployment, none of it registered as real accomplishment in that house. "All you do is wear a uniform," Megan told me once at Christmas, swirling wine in her glass like she'd said something clever. "Nobody even remembers your name outside that base." I remember smiling at her that night. Not because it didn't hurt, it did, but because I had already decided somewhere in the years before that I would not hand my family the satisfaction of watching me bleed. Growing up, I was largely on my own. Not homeless, not neglected in any way a court would recognize, but emotionally, functionally alone in a house full of people. I made my own lunch money by babysitting neighborhood kids. I filled out my own college applications, my own military paperwork, my own dreams, because there was no one in that house interested in filling anything out with me. When I left for basic training, I packed my own bag and called a cab to the bus station because no one offered to drive me. I remember sitting in the back of that cab watching my childhood house shrink in the rearview mirror and thinking quite calmly that I was finally starting my real life. 14 years later, standing in my quarters after that phone call, I felt something different than sadness. I felt clarity. My father's voice, so certain, so dismissive, had told me everything I needed to know about where I stood with my family one final time, in case I had somehow forgotten. I did not cry. I did not call back to argue my case. I simply set my phone down on the dresser, smoothed the front of my uniform in the mirror, and reminded myself of something I'd learned a long time ago in this line of work. The people who doubt you the loudest are rarely the ones standing beside you when it counts. 3 days later, on a clear autumn morning, I stood on a stage at the base sunlight cutting sharp lines across the parade ground, and I looked out at the small crowd gathered to watch my promotion. My chain of command was there. Fellow officers I'd served beside for years. A few enlisted soldiers I'd mentored watching with quiet pride. Not one member of my family occupied a single seat in that crowd. And yet, as the lieutenant general stepped up to pin the new rank onto my collar, I felt something settle inside me that had nothing to do with who was absent, and everything to do with who was standing right in front of me. I had no idea in that moment that a photograph taken that very day would soon travel further than any of us could have imagined. The ceremony itself lasted less than 20 minutes, but every second of it felt deliberate, weighted with a kind of significance I hadn't expected to feel so sharply. Lieutenant General Marcus Whitfield presided over the promotion personally, which was itself unusual for a captain's ceremony. Colonels typically handled these, sometimes even majors. But General Whitfield had overseen the strategic planning division I'd been quietly training toward for the better part of 2 years, and his presence told me before anyone said a word that something larger was unfolding. He read my service record aloud before the pinning. 14 years of service. 2 deployments to hostile regions I still couldn't discuss in detail with civilians, a commendation for actions during an extraction mission that I rarely thought about anymore, not because it didn't matter, but because dwelling on it never helped me sleep. He spoke about discipline, about quiet competence, about the kind of officer who does the work without needing an audience. Then he stepped forward, removed my old rank insignia, and replaced it with the new one. Captain Allison Reed. The applause that followed came from soldiers and officers who actually knew what those 14 years had cost me. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I let myself feel proud without immediately searching the crowd for someone who wasn't there. After the formal portion ended, General Whitfield asked me to remain behind while the rest of the attendees dispersed toward the reception hall. He led me to a quieter corner near the flagpole, hands clasped behind his back, and told me something that made my chest tighten in an entirely different way than my father's phone call had 3 days earlier. I was being reassigned. Not to another base, not to another training command, but to the Pentagon, as part of a small strategic planning team reporting directly to senior leadership within the Department of Defense. It was not an administrative posting. It was a position typically reserved for officers a decade older than me with resumes twice as long. He said my name had come up in committee discussions more than once over the past year following work I'd done on a classified operational review that I hadn't even realized had traveled that far up the chain. I don't remember exactly what I said in response. Something appropriately composed, something about being honored and ready to serve wherever needed. Inside, though, something quieter and more permanent was settling into place, a confirmation after 14 years that the work had mattered, even when no one at home had cared to notice. A military journalist covering the ceremony for the base's public affairs office had been present throughout, snapping photographs of the pinning ceremony for a routine internal news release. One image in particular caught something the others hadn't: me, stepping down from the stage, spine, straight expression, calm new captain's bars, catching the morning light. General Whitfield's hand resting briefly on my shoulder in a gesture of quiet endorsement. It was, by any measure, an unremarkable photograph, the kind taken at hundreds of ceremonies across the country every year. Except this one didn't stay unremarkable for long. 2 days after the ceremony, a national defense publication ran a feature on rising officers moving into strategic leadership roles within the Pentagon, and my name and photograph anchored the piece. The headline read plainly, "Pentagon appoints Captain Allison Reed to Strategic Leadership Team." The accompanying photograph showed me walking into the Pentagon complex on my first orientation day, flanked by 2 security personnel. My expression unreadable, my bearing unmistakably professional. It was a modest feature by national news standards, buried several pages into a broader story about defense restructuring. But modest in the age of shared links and screenshots doesn't mean invisible. The story began circulating first among military circles, then defense policy forums, then eventually into the wider currents of social media, the way certain stories do when they intersect with a compelling image and an unexpected name. I wasn't looking for attention. I hadn't posted about it anywhere myself. My personal social media presence had been dormant for years, a casualty of deployments and long hours. But attention doesn't require participation. It only requires visibility. And a photograph of me walking into the Pentagon flanked by security had plenty of that. The first person in my family to see it was Megan. She found it ironically through her own network of local business contacts, someone sharing the defense article with a caption expressing surprise that a name from our small town had ended up in a national security publication. Megan told me later, much later, that her first reaction wasn't pride or excitement. It was disbelief, followed quickly by suspicion. She assumed it was a mistake, a different Allison Reed, a coincidence of names in a country with millions of people. She searched. She found my name attached to a LinkedIn profile she hadn't known existed, updated sparsely but unmistakably mine. She found a Department of Defense press release listing me among a small cohort of officers joining the strategic team. She found finally undeniable confirmation that the woman in the photograph, the woman flanked by security walking into one of the most secured buildings in the country, was her sister. The sister she had mocked at Christmas. The sister she'd told, just days earlier, that nobody even remembered her name. I didn't hear from Megan directly. I heard instead that my father had gone quiet for an entire day, refusing to discuss the article when a neighbor mentioned it to him at the hardware store. Quiet for a man like my father was never actually quiet. It was the sound of pride recalculating itself slowly, painfully, in a room no one else was allowed to witness. That evening, for the first time in longer than I could remember, my phone lit up with a text message from him. 2 words, no context, no apology, no acknowledgement of the ceremony he'd dismissed as pathetic just days before. "Call me." I stared at those 2 words for a long time before setting the phone face down on the counter. I already knew somehow that whatever came next would not be about celebrating what I'd earned. It would be about what they suddenly believed I could offer them. I didn't call him back that night. I let the message sit there, 2 words glowing on my phone screen while I finished the reports waiting on my desk for my final week at the base before relocating to Washington. There was something almost peaceful in the delay, a small private exercise of control after 14 years of answering every summons from that house on command. I had learned slowly and at great cost that not everything deserved an immediate response. He called the next morning instead, and I let it ring twice before answering, not out of games, but because I needed the extra seconds to steady myself. His voice, when I finally picked up, sounded nothing like the man who had told me not to waste my time on a pathetic little promotion ceremony 4 days earlier. It was measured, careful, almost warm in a way that felt foreign coming from him. "Allison," he said, and then paused like he was searching for the right follow-up. "We saw the article." I didn't offer anything back right away. I'd learned that silence in conversations like this usually revealed more than words could. "The Pentagon," he continued when I didn't fill the gap. That's a big deal, Allison. Why didn't you tell us?" I could have reminded him that I'd tried to tell them plenty of things over 14 years about basic training, about my first deployment, about the medal I received that no one in that house ever asked to see. I could have told him that I stopped sharing things a long time ago because sharing had only ever been met with indifference or mockery. Instead, I simply said, "It didn't come up." There was a silence on his end, thick with things unsaid, before he cleared his throat and said the words that told me exactly what was coming. "We should have a family meeting, tomorrow morning, all of us. Not a question. Not an invitation extended with any humility. A statement delivered the way he'd delivered every directive in that house for as long as I could remember, as though the years hadn't changed a single thing between us, as though a national news article was simply a correction to an old misunderstanding, rather than proof of exactly who I'd become without their help. "Okay," I said, "just that." No enthusiasm, no relief, no rush of hope that this might finally be the moment things shifted between us. I had learned not to hope for very long ago, not because I'd become bitter, but because hope in that house had always been the most expensive thing I owned and the least likely to pay out. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, turning the conversation over in my mind. 14 years of near silence, and it took one photograph, one headline, one national publication for my father to remember he had a daughter worth calling. I understood with a clarity that felt almost clinical exactly what was happening. This wasn't reconciliation. This was recalibration. My family hadn't suddenly discovered they valued me for who I was. They had discovered, through a lens entirely external to our relationship, that I might be valuable to them. I thought about Megan too, and what she must have felt scrolling through that article, cross-referencing my name against a Department of Defense database, watching her assumptions about her older sister collapse in real time. I imagined her searching frantically the way people do when a fact refuses to align with the story they've told themselves for years. I imagined the particular vertigo of realizing the person you've spent years dismissing has been operating on a plane you never bothered to look up and see. That evening, I called my closest friend from officer training, Captain Denise Whitmore, who had been stationed with me during my first deployment, and understood my family history better than almost anyone. I told her about the meeting, about my father's sudden warmth, about the strange hollow feeling of being wanted for the first time in years, wrapped in the unmistakable knowledge that it wasn't really me they wanted at all. "You don't have to go," Denise reminded me, her voice steady through the phone the way it had been steady through worse things than family drama. "I know," I said. And I meant it. I wasn't obligated to walk back into that house, wasn't required to sit at that table and perform whatever reconciliation they'd scripted in their minds. But some part of me, quieter and more stubborn than my pride, wanted to see it through. Not because I expected an apology that would actually mean something. Not because I believed even for a moment that 14 years of dismissal could be undone over coffee at my parents' kitchen table. I wanted to go because I needed to see with my own eyes exactly what my family had become in the sudden light of my success, and exactly what they had always been underneath the years of indifference. I thought about the ceremony, about the empty seats where my family should have sat, about General Whitfield's hand on my shoulder in the photograph that had changed everything, without changing anything about who I actually was. I had been the same officer the day before that article ran as I was the day after. The same woman who trained recruits at dawn, who studied strategic doctrine late into the night, who carried the weight of decisions most civilians never had to make. Nothing about my character had shifted. Only their perception had, and only because an external authority, a newspaper, a headline, a photograph had validated something they'd refused to see on their own for 14 years. That night I laid out my service dress uniform on the bed, pressed and precise, and I made a decision. I would not walk into that house dressed as their daughter, hoping quietly for approval the way I once had. I would walk in as Captain Allison Reed, exactly as the world had come to know me, and I would let them reckon with whoever that person turned out to be. The drive to my parents' house took just under 2 hours, and I spent most of it in a silence that felt less like nervousness and more like preparation. The same quiet focus I used to settle into before briefings that mattered. I wore my service dress uniform pressed sharp, new captain's bars catching the morning light exactly as they had the day of my promotion. I hadn't worn it home in years. There had never been an occasion that warranted it not in their eyes, and I had stopped trying to create one a long time ago. A government vehicle followed me for part of the route, carrying 2 security personnel assigned to me temporarily during this transitional period, before my full relocation to Washington Standard Protocol, given the sensitivity of my incoming role. I hadn't thought much about it during the drive. It was simply part of my life now, the way certain routines become invisible once you're inside them long enough. I had no idea what that vehicle parked outside my childhood home would do to the 4 people waiting inside. My father opened the door before I even reached it, likely watching from the front window the way he always had, keeping tabs on the driveway like it was a business he was auditing. He froze mid-step, and for a moment I watched something complicated pass behind his eyes. It wasn't the uniform that stopped him. I realized, though, the uniform certainly wasn't nothing. It was the vehicle parked at the curb behind me, and the 2 security personnel stepping out with the kind of quiet, practiced discipline that told anyone watching this was not a casual visit from a hometown girl who'd joined the army. "Allison," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the second syllable, something I had genuinely never heard from him before. I walked up the steps at an even pace, neither rushing to embrace him nor holding back with visible coldness. "Dad," I said, and let that be enough. Inside the house smelled the way it always had: coffee, and the faint trace of my mother's lavender candles, a scent that used to comfort me as a child, and now simply registered as background information evidence of a life I'd left behind, more thoroughly than I think any of them understood until this morning. My mother stood near the kitchen island, hands twisting a dish towel, eyes darting between me and the window where the government vehicle was still visible. She didn't rush toward me either. She seemed almost afraid to. Megan was the one who moved first, crossing the living room in a few quick steps, arms already extending for a hug before I'd fully entered the room. "Allison, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I feel terrible about what I said." The words tumbled out fast, rehearsed in the way apologies sometimes are when someone has practiced them in a mirror the night before, testing different phrasings, until one felt sufficiently convincing. I accepted the hug briefly, my arms coming up out of habit more than warmth, and then I stepped back at a pace that made clear I wasn't interested in prolonging it. Megan's smile faltered slightly at the retreat, though she covered it quickly, gesturing me toward the dining table like she was hosting an honored guest, rather than the sister she'd humiliated at Christmas. We sat. My father took his usual seat at the head of the table, though something in his posture seemed diminished from how I remembered him occupying that space, less like a king surveying his kingdom, and more like a man recalculating the room's hierarchy in real time. My mother poured coffee no one had asked for, an old nervous habit of hers, filling silence with small tasks whenever real conversation threatened to arrive. "You should come home more often," my father said, finally folding his hands on the table in a gesture that might have looked like humility on another man. I let a small measured smile settle on my face, the kind I'd perfected over years of controlling my expressions in rooms far more hostile than my parents' dining room. "I used to try," I said simply. The words landed exactly the way I intended them to. Not an accusation, not raised in volume or edged with old resentment, just a plain statement of fact that hung in the air and refused to be softened by anyone's discomfort. My mother's hand stilled on the coffee pot. Megan's eyes dropped briefly to the table. My father's jaw tightened the way it always had when he was searching for a rebuttal and couldn't quite locate one. "We know things haven't always been," he started, then trailed off, apparently unable to find language for 14 years of dismissal that wouldn't sound as damning out loud as it clearly felt in his own head. I didn't finish his sentence for him. I let it hang there unfinished, the way so many things between us had always been left unfinished, swept aside in favor of easier topics, easier silences. Megan tried a different approach, leaning forward with the particular brightness I recognized from her online videos, the performance of enthusiasm she'd built an entire following on. "I still can't believe it, though, the Pentagon. That's incredible, Allison. You have to tell us everything." I studied her for a moment. I recognized this curiosity dressed up as pride interest that had everything to do with my new visibility and nothing to do with the 14 years I'd spent building toward it in total obscurity. I gave her nothing more than the barest outline of my reassignment, careful with classification protocols I couldn't discuss, even if I'd wanted to share more, which, if I was honest with myself, I didn't. The conversation continued in this uneven rhythm for several more minutes, my father attempting warmth he'd never previously extended my mother, filling silences with coffee and small kindnesses. Years too late, Megan performing an enthusiasm that felt to me thinner with every passing sentence. I remained polite throughout, controlled, present in the room, but guarded in every way that mattered, watching a family recalibrate itself around a version of me they had only just discovered was worth paying attention to. Beneath the surface of that careful, cordial conversation, I could feel something building, unspoken but unmistakable, the way pressure builds before weather finally breaks. They hadn't called this meeting to celebrate me. They had called it because they needed something, and I was beginning to understand with each passing minute at that table exactly what that something was going to turn out to be. The coffee had gone cold in front of me by the time my father finally set his cup down and cleared his throat in the particular way he always did before delivering something he considered important. I recognized the gesture instantly, even after all these years away. It was the same throat clear he used before announcing a business decision at dinner, the same one that preceded every unilateral pronouncement he'd ever made about our lives, without asking permission first. "Allison," he said, folding his hands together on the table with a deliberateness that made my stomach tighten slightly, though my face gave nothing away. "I've been wanting to talk to you about something, business-related." I said, nothing waiting already, sensing the shape of what was coming before he gave it words. "The company's been trying to land a federal contract for almost 2 years now," he continued, leaning forward slightly. "Infrastructure supply work. It would change everything for us, Allison. Steady government business, guaranteed payment cycles, the kind of stability that could set up your mother and me for the rest of our lives." He paused, watching my face for a reaction I refused to give him. "With you at the Pentagon now, I thought maybe you could put in a word, just an introduction. Point us toward the right people." There it was. Not concern for my well-being, not curiosity about the years I'd spent building a career they'd dismissed as beneath consideration, but a business proposition delivered at his own dining table 4 days after telling me my promotion ceremony was pathetic. I set my own cup down carefully, giving myself a moment before responding, though the answer had already formed itself the instant he mentioned the word contract. "I can't do that," I said, my voice even unhurried. "It's a serious conflict of interest. What you're describing would violate federal ethics regulations, and it could end my career before it's even started in this new role." His expression shifted, surprise giving way quickly to something harder. "Nobody has to know it came from you. Just a name, a phone call. That's all I'm asking." "That's exactly the kind of thing that would be discovered," I said. "These processes are audited. Connections like that get flagged. I'm not willing to risk 14 years of work for a supply contract." I kept my tone level professional, the same tone I used when explaining operational limitations to junior officers who wanted shortcuts around protocol. His jaw tightened, the same tightening I remembered from childhood dinners, when I'd asked questions he didn't want to answer. "We're family," he said, like the words themselves were supposed to dissolve every regulation, every consequence, every year of distance he'd created between us with his own choices. "This is what family does for each other." I looked at him directly, something steady settling into my chest, a kind of clarity I hadn't expected to feel so completely in that moment. "That's exactly why I won't do it," I said. The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones, sharper, heavier, carrying an accusation neither of us spoke aloud. My mother's hand had gone still on the table. Megan shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable, though not I noticed uncomfortable enough to change the subject away from what she wanted. "Well," Megan said, forcing brightness back into her voice after a beat too long, "maybe you could at least talk to someone about getting me connected with a reporter, someone who covers military families or Pentagon culture, something like that. It would be huge for my platform, Allison. I could actually build something real instead of just local content." She said this like she was offering me a favor rather than asking for one. Like connecting her to journalists covering national security matters was a reasonable request between sisters, rather than another attempt to convert my career into her opportunity. I felt something in my chest that wasn't quite anger, something closer to a very old exhaustion finally reaching its edge. "I'm not going to do that either," I said. Megan's smile flickered, faltering at the directness of my refusal. "Why not? It's not like it's illegal or anything. It's just an introduction." "Because that's not why I have this position," I said. "And because every relationship I have professionally I built by staying quiet and doing the work, not by leveraging family connections to get someone airtime." I paused, letting my eyes move slowly across the table, taking in my father's tightened jaw, my mother's downcast eyes, Megan's barely concealed frustration. "That's something none of you have ever really understood about me." The room had shifted entirely now, the careful cordiality of the morning dissolving into something rawer, more honest. My father's earlier warmth had evaporated, completely replaced by the same cold irritation I remembered from a childhood spent disappointing him simply by being myself, rather than the daughter he'd wanted. Megan's performance of sisterly reconciliation had thinned into visible frustration at being denied something she clearly believed was owed to her. Only my mother remained quiet, her eyes moving between the three of us like she was watching a car accident she'd seen coming from a long way off and still hadn't found the courage to prevent. "You've changed," my father said finally, and it wasn't a compliment. "No?" I said, and for the first time since walking through that door, I let something firmer creep into my voice. I haven't changed at all. You're just seeing me clearly for the first time. The masks that had greeted me at the door that morning. Megan's tearful apology, my father's uncharacteristic warmth. My mother's nervous hospitality had fallen away completely, now revealing the same family dynamic that had defined every year of my childhood and every year since I'd left it behind. They hadn't called this meeting because they'd finally recognized my worth. They'd called it because they'd recognized my usefulness. And now that I'd made clear I wouldn't be useful in the ways they wanted, the temperature in that room had dropped several degrees in the span of a single conversation. I sat back slightly in my chair, watching them recalibrate again, watching my father search for another angle, watching Megan's mind visibly working toward some alternate request. And I realized with a clarity that felt almost peaceful that nothing that happened next in that conversation was going to surprise me anymore. My father didn't let it go. I hadn't expected him to. Men like Richard Reed don't retreat from a closed door. They simply look for a different one to try. He shifted in his chair, his voice rising, slightly edged now with the particular frustration he reserved for moments when the world refused to bend to his expectations. "Everything we've ever done," he said, "has been for this family. For you, for your sister, for your mother. You think it's been easy building that business from nothing? You think I haven't sacrificed for all of you?" His voice cracked on the last word, though I couldn't tell if it was genuine emotion or simply the performance of it sharpened by years of using guilt as a tool whenever direct requests failed. Something in me, some door I had kept quietly latched for 14 years, came loose in that moment. I hadn't planned to say what came next. I had walked into that house intending to remain composed, professional, unmoved by whatever performance awaited me. But sitting there listening to my father frame his own self-interest as sacrifice, something in me finally needed to speak the truth out loud, not as an accusation, but simply as fact, the way I might report an incident during a debrief. "Do you know what day I left for basic training?" I asked, and my voice stayed level, almost conversational, which somehow made the words land harder than if I'd shouted them. "I called a cab to the bus station because nobody offered to drive me. I sat in the back seat and watched this house get smaller in the rearview mirror, and I told myself that was fine, because I was finally starting something that belonged only to me." My father opened his mouth, but I continued before he could speak, my voice steady, unhurried, the way I'd learned to deliver difficult information in briefings where emotion had no operational value. "The day I graduated basic training, I looked for you in the crowd. I knew you probably wouldn't come, but some part of me still looked anyway. Nobody was there. I called this house that night to tell you I'd finished, and you asked when I'd be transferring somewhere with better pay." My mother's hand had gone completely still on the table now, her eyes fixed somewhere just past my shoulder, unable to meet mine directly. "During my first deployment, I went 11 months without a single letter or call from this house. Not because communication wasn't possible, because nobody tried. I told myself that was fine too. I told myself a lot of things were fine for a long time because it was easier than admitting how much it actually cost me to keep hoping otherwise. I paused not for effect, but because even now delivering these facts without visible emotion required a kind of discipline I'd spent years building. The day I received a commendation for actions during an extraction mission, actions that still visit me in ways I don't discuss with anyone. Nobody in this house even knew it happened. I didn't tell you. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because by then, I'd learned that sharing anything with this family only ever resulted in dismissal or indifference, and I couldn't afford either one anymore. I needed to protect the parts of myself that were still standing. I hadn't raised my voice once during any of this. I hadn't cried, hadn't let my composure slip, hadn't given my father the satisfaction of watching me break the way I might have years earlier, before the Army taught me that emotional control was its own form of strength. I simply stated what had happened plainly, the way I might read facts off an incident report, and somehow that plainness cut deeper into the room than any accusation could have. My mother broke first. I watched the tears come slow at first, then faster, tracking down her face as she pressed a hand against her mouth like she could physically hold back whatever admission was trying to surface. "I didn't realize," she said, her voice thick and unsteady. "I told myself you were fine. You always seemed so fine, Allison, so capable. I told myself you didn't need us the way Megan did. I needed you exactly the way Megan did, I said quietly. I just learned not to show it because showing it never got me anywhere. Megan had gone very still across the table. Her earlier bright performative energy completely drained away, replaced by something that looked for the first time since I'd walked through that door like genuine reckoning. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She was staring down at her own hands, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost every trace of the influencer polish she usually wrapped around her words. I used to tell people at school that my sister was in the army like it was something to be embarrassed about, she said almost to herself. I never once asked you what it was actually like, not once in 14 years. She looked up at me then, and I saw something crack open behind her eyes, something that looked uncomfortably like shame finally arriving after years of being kept at a careful distance. My father remained silent, his earlier bluster gone entirely replaced by an expression I couldn't quite name, somewhere between confusion and the beginning of something he clearly didn't want to examine too closely. He wasn't crying. He wasn't apologizing either. But something in his face had shifted, some certainty he'd carried for 14 years, finally showing its first hairline crack. I sat back in my chair watching the wreckage of my own honesty settle across the table, and I felt no satisfaction in it. Only a quiet, exhausted relief, the kind that comes after finally setting down something heavy you've carried for far too long. Nobody spoke for a long moment after Megan's admission settled into the room. I watched my mother wipe her face with the sleeve of her cardigan, watched my father stare down at his folded hands, like they belonged to someone else, watched Megan search my expression for something I wasn't ready to give her yet. I felt the weight of 14 years pressing against the walls of that kitchen finally acknowledged out loud. And I understood sitting there. That acknowledgement alone wasn't going to be enough to change anything fundamental between us. I stood up, slowly smoothing the front of my uniform out of habit rather than necessity. My father looked up at the movement, something almost desperate flickering across his face, like he sensed the conversation slipping away from him before he'd extracted whatever resolution he'd been hoping for when he called this meeting. "Allison," he started, "we can fix this. We can be better. Just give us a chance to—" "I'm not angry," I said, and I meant it, which surprised me almost as much as it seemed to surprise him. "I'm not here for revenge, and I'm not interested in punishing anyone at this table. That was never what today was about." I paused, choosing my next words carefully, wanting them to land exactly as true as they felt. The promotion wasn't what mattered. Not really. What I wanted to know when I called you about that ceremony was whether this family could show up for me without needing a headline to convince you I was worth showing up for. My father's mouth opened slightly, but no answer came. I hadn't expected one. Some questions aren't meant to be answered out loud. They're meant to sit with a person long after the conversation ends, working their way slowly into whatever conscience remains available to receive them. I don't know what happens next between us. I continued, my voice steady, neither cold nor overly soft. Simply honest in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be with this family in longer than I could remember. But I needed you to hear clearly that I see exactly what happened here. I see that it took a national news article for you to remember I existed in a way worth calling about. I see that the first thing you thought to ask me for was a favor, not an apology. I looked at each of them in turn, my mother's tear-streaked face, my father's unreadable silence, Megan's uncertain, newly humbled expression. That tells me everything I need to know about where I actually stood in this house long before that photograph ever existed. I walked toward the front door without waiting for a response, my footsteps even, and unhurried across the same floors I'd grown up on, floors that had witnessed every dismissal, every skipped ceremony, every quiet moment of being overlooked in favor of someone easier to love. My mother called my name once softly, but I didn't turn around. Some exits require you to keep moving forward, or the weight of everything behind you will pull you back into patterns you've spent years working to leave. The government vehicle was still waiting at the curb engine, idling, my 2 security escorts standing at ease beside it. I climbed into the back seat, and as we pulled away from the house, I watched it shrink in the side mirror, the same way it had 13 years earlier, the night I left for basic training in the back of a cab nobody had offered to drive. Except this time, I didn't feel the hollow ache of abandonment that had followed me down that road years ago. I felt something quieter, Steadier, closer to peace than anything I'd carried away from that house before. Several months passed before I saw my family again, and even then only from a distance through a television screen in my new apartment near Washington. I had been asked to appear alongside the Secretary of Defense at a national ceremony honoring strategic planning contributions to a recent policy initiative. A brief appearance, a handshake, a few words exchanged on camera about the importance of steady leadership during uncertain times. I didn't think about my family while I stood there. I thought about the 18-year-old who'd called a cab to a bus station and how far she'd traveled since then entirely under her own power. I found out later that my father saw that broadcast. A neighbor mentioned it to him the same way a neighbor had first mentioned the newspaper article that started all of this. I don't know what he felt watching it. I don't know if shame settled into him permanently or if it faded the way old certainties sometimes do, back into whatever comfortable version of the past he needed to keep believing. What I do know is that nobody in that house ever called me useless again, not directly. And I stopped needing them to say anything at all because I had finally stopped waiting for their permission to know my own worth. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't have articulated the day my father called my promotion pathetic. That phone call wasn't the day I lost my family. My family in the way I'd always hoped for. One had been unavailable to me for years before that conversation ever happened. What that call actually marked was the day I stopped chasing people who had already decided long ago not to see what I was worth. And once I stopped chasing, I found there was so much room left over for the life I'd actually built quietly. One deployment, one promotion, one difficult year at a time, entirely on my own terms. I still think about that empty row of seats at my promotion ceremony sometimes, but it doesn't sting the way it once did. Because I've learned that the people meant to stand beside you don't always share your last name. And sometimes the family you build through service and shared purpose turns out to be steadier than the one you were born into. I want to know where this story finds you tonight. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. We have so many more stories like this one to share with you every single day, so make sure you subscribe so you never miss a moment like this. Let's keep this journey going together.